Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation on the peripheral nervous system. So to start, let's begin with sensory receptors. Sensory receptors are like cell phones within our body that collect different types of messages and send them to the brain. The formal definition of sensory receptors are specialized structures that respond to changes within the environment, also known as stimuli. Our sensory receptors go ahead and detect two different types of senses. You have general senses and special senses. And then our sensory receptors can also be classified by stimulus, location, and structure, which we will go further into detail. So what are the differences in our general senses versus our special senses? Our general senses are senses that detect stimuli like pain, temperature, touch, and pressure, and these are found all over the body. Then our special senses are localized to specific organs. These assist in hearing, vision, taste, smell, and balance. So in general, I like to think of the general senses are like your body's everyday tools, while the special senses are like the high-tech gadgets your body uses. Moving forward to the classification of sensory receptors, we have structure, function, and stimulus. Starting with structure, you have the free nerve endings, which detect pain and temperature. Then you have complex receptors like special structures within the eye or the ear, and they detect vision and hearing. Then going on to the classification due to their function, you have mechanical receptors, which respond to mechanical stimuli. This can be pressure or vibration. Photoreceptors, which respond to light. They are found within the eye. Thermoreceptors, which respond to temperature. Chemoreceptors, which respond to chemical changes, such as taste or smell. Then we have the nociceptors, which respond to pain. Then going on to classification depending on stimulus. We have the exteroreceptors, which respond to external stimuli like touch and temperature, interoceptors, which are internal stimuli, hunger and heart rate, proprioceptors, which are responsible for the body position stimuli, that can be balance and muscle tension. So how does our body communicate with our brain? It does so through receptor potentials and action potentials. Receptor potentials are a change in a sensory receptor's membrane potential when a stimulus is detected. Action potentials are if a receptor potential is strong enough, an action potential will go ahead and be triggered, sending a signal up to the brain. So I like to think of the receptor potential like a switch that triggers an electrical signal from the lights to turn on. That's why there's an on and off switch. And then if the action potential to be reached, in order for that threshold to be reached, the button needs to be completely pressed. So what are the steps in the way this works? So first you have stimulus detection. A specific stimulus like touch, light, heat will activate a sensory receptor. This will go ahead and open or close ion channels. The local change in membrane potential will cause the movement of ions to create a graded potential in the receptor. Then the third portion is the threshold is reached. If the graded potential is strong enough to reach a threshold, voltage-gated sodium channels will open. And then step 4 is the signal transmission. Propagation occurs. The action potential goes ahead and travels along the sensory neuron's axon toward the spinal cord and to the brain. The signal will go ahead and then reach the central nervous system where it is processed and interpreted. So how does our central nervous system determine the intensity of a stimulus? It does so by two ways: the frequency of an action potential and the number of receptors that are activated by these action potentials. The word frequency means how fast the signals are sent, and then again it depends on the number of receptors that are activated as well. So for example, let's think of decoding the loudness of a stimuli. Imagine clapping. A gentle clap will go ahead and generate fewer action potentials, and a loud clap will go ahead and generate more action potentials. You can even think about it with a quiet hum versus a loud roar. A quiet hum will go ahead and generate fewer action potentials per second and activate fewer receptors compared to a loud clap or roar, which goes ahead and generates more frequent action potentials, causing more activations in the receptors as well. Moving forward to two different types of receptors, you have tonic receptors and phasic receptors. Before we go on to these two different types of receptors, let's go over the term adaptation. Adaptation is a change in sensitivity to a constant stimulus. So tonic receptors continuously respond if there is a stimulus present. They adapt slowly. An example of this would be our pain receptors. So the tonic receptors are always active as long as there is a stimulus. For example, think of a bee stinger. If there is a bee stinger within you, you'll feel pain as long as the bee stinger is there. But if the bee stinger is removed, the pain will discontinue. But within this term, you can see that every red line is an action potential, and in the beginning, the action potential is high, but over time, the pain is high, and then it'll die down, and it'll adapt. So you can see it slowly adapts. The action potentials die down. And then we have our phasic receptors, which briefly respond to stimuli, and they adapt quickly. An example of this would be like smell and photoreceptors. So these phasic ones are rapidly adapting and they go ahead and feel it immediately, then your body kind of forgets it. So action potentials will stop firing upon this constant stimulation. For example, placing jewelry on, you'll feel it at first and then your body will go ahead and forget about it. Or when you step into bright sunlight from a dark room, your photoreceptors initially respond strongly, but then they adapt quickly, allowing you to see clearly in the bright conditions. And in this breakdown in the picture on the right side, you can see there is multiple action potentials in the beginning and then they die down. So how does our body feel sensation or stimuli? It does so through general somatic afferent pathways, also known as GSA. These are neural routes that transmit sensory information from the body to the central nervous system. Now let's dive deeper into detail of those. So to begin, you have receptor activation. I like to think of like a hot stove being the stimulus. The receptors in your skin will go ahead and detect the high temperature from the stove. Think of them as tiny heat sensors within your skin. Then it'll go on to the first order neurons. The first order neuron will go ahead and carry the signal from the receptors down to the spinal cord. Then we have our third order neuron, which will go ahead and carry it from the thalamus to the cortex. In the thalamus, the signal is relayed to the third order neuron, which sends it to the somatosensory cortex, which is found in the parietal lobe of the brain. And this is where the conscious perception will go ahead and occur of sensation. And the final step is within the brain, the cerebral cortex. The somatosensory cortex will process the signal and you will consciously feel the pain of the hot stove and know exactly where to pull your hand away from the heat. So how does the central nervous system localize the sensation? It does so through the somatotopic organization. This is like a map within your body. The cortex within our brain has a map, allowing our brain to know exactly where the sensation of pain is coming from based on the area involved. So it allows specific regions to correspond to specific parts, allowing precise localization of sensory localization. Once again, going over the topic with the touching the hot stove, the heat causes the receptors to be activated and then send signals through the specific pathway, ultimately reaching the specific area in the cortex that is responsible for the hand, or specifically the fingers. So what are afferent pathways and where do they lead? Afferent pathways are neural routes that carry sensory information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system, from the PNS to the CNS. We have two different pathways. One pathway terminates in the cerebral cortex while the other does not. It terminates in the brainstem or the hypothalamus. The first pathway, which go ahead and terminates in the cerebral cortex, is responsible for conscious processing of sensory information. This can be something like visual and auditory pathways. Visual pathways end in the primary visual cortex and the auditory end in the primary auditory cortex. Going on to the second pathway, which terminates in the brainstem and the hypothalamus, not in the cerebral cortex. They regulate autonomic functions, which are unconscious functions. This could be something like your heart rate, oxygen levels, or even blood pressure. So the baroreceptor goes ahead and monitors blood pressure, projects to the brainstem. Then we have visceral pathways. The word visceral means organ, so these pathways regulate the autonomic functions like the heart rate, digestion, and respiration. So we briefly went over pain receptors, but let's go deeper into them. So nociceptors are our pain receptors. There's different pathways they also have. So nociceptors are specialized sensory receptors that detect harmful stimuli. These can be found in the skin, muscles, joints, bones, and internal organs. There's different types of nociceptors. They depend on mechanical. They detect physical change. Thermal detect extreme heat or cold. Chemical respond to harmful chemicals. polymodal, which go ahead and respond to multiple stimuli. They can be mechanical, thermal, or chemical. Then our pain receptors also have different types of nerve fibers. You have A delta fibers, which are myelinated, fast conducting, carry sharp localized pain. Then our C fibers, which are unmyelinated, slow conducting, carry dull, aching, or burning pains out. So how is pain perceived and processed? First, by localization. The somatosensory cortex determines the exact location of the pain. Then intensity, encoded by the frequency of action potentials and the number of nociceptors that are activated. Then the final one is the emotional response. The limbic system processes emotional aspects of pain. This can be something like fear or distress. Before going over this slide, let's go over the term acuity. Acuity means precision in identifying the location of a stimulus. So this is how we are able to define where a stimulus is coming from. And it depends on multiple different things. It can be the receptive field, convergence, lateral inhibition. So receptive fields are an area from which a sensory neuron receives input. So the smaller a receptive field, the greater acuity and low sensitivity. The larger a receptive field, the lower acuity. For example, our fingertips have small receptive fields, which assist with enabling fine touch. Then we have convergence. Multiple neurons synapse onto a single second-order neuron. This increases sensitivity and covered area, so it goes ahead and decreases the acuity, makes it harder to detect where the stimulus is coming from. Then we have lateral inhibition. Neurons are activated by a stimulus to inhibit neighboring neurons. By shutting off and turning off those neighboring neurons, it sharpens the stimulus contrast and enhancing acuity. Moving on to our 12 pairs of cranial nerves. First, we have the olfactory, which is located in the nasal cavity and responsible for smell. Then we have the optic, which is responsible for the vision and is located in retina. Then we have our ocular motor, which is responsible for eye movement found within the midbrain. We have the trochlear, which is responsible for eye movement, also found within the midbrain. Then we have the trigeminal facial sensation, responsible for chewing. It's found within the pons. Then we have the abducens, which is responsible for eye movement, which is found in the pons. The facial nerve, which is responsible for facial expression and taste, found within the pons. Then we have the vestibular cochlear, which is responsible for hearing and balance, found within the inner ear. Glossopharyngeal, which is responsible for taste swallowing, found within our medulla. Then we have our vagus nerve, which is autonomic control, found within the medulla as well. Then we have our accessory nerve, which is responsible for shoulder and head movement, found within the medulla. And then the final one is the hypoglossal cranial nerve, which is responsible for tongue movement, found within the medulla as well. One way to remember all 12 pairs of the cranial nerves is a mnemonic. One I like is, on occasion, our trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow. So our spinal nerves go ahead and originate from dorsal roots and ventral roots. The dorsal roots contain sensory afferent fibers from sensory neurons in the dorsal root ganglia. These fibers conduct action potentials from peripheral receptors to the spinal cord. Then we have the ventral roots. These contain motor efferent fibers that arise from motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. These fibers extend to and innervate the skeletal muscles. Then the branches of the spinal nerve, also known as the rami. You have the dorsal rami. It innervates skin and muscles of the back. The ventral, which innervates the anterior body and limbs. And then the meningeal branch, which re-enters the spinal canal to innervate the meninges. Going on to our spinal nerve plexuses. A plexus is a network of intersecting nerves that ensure each limb receives nerve supply from more than just one spinal nerve. It's crucial for muscle function and coordination, allows for redundancy and protection against nerve damage, ensuring that if one spinal nerve is damaged, the limb can still function. So the cervical plexus goes ahead and controls C1 to C4. An example of this would be the phrenic nerve, which controls our breathing. Then we have the brachial plexus, which is C5 to T1. It controls the median nerve. The median nerve goes ahead and controls the forearm flexion and thumb opposition. Then we have the lumbar plexus, which covers the L1 through L4 region. An example within this region is the femoral nerve, which is responsible for hip flexion and knee extension. Then we have the sacral plexus, which covers L4 through S4. It's responsible for the sciatic nerve, and this is responsible for the posterior thigh and leg. So what are reflex arcs? Reflex arcs are neural pathways involved in producing an automatic rapid response to a stimulus. These are essential for maintaining homeostasis and protecting our bodies from harm. So let's go over this example with touching a hot cup. So first you have a receptor. A pain receptor in the skin detects your hand touching a hot cup. Then you have a sensory neuron. It'll go ahead and transmit the signal to the spinal cord. Then we have our integration center, which is within the spinal cord. The signal is processed and a response is determined. Then we have the motor neuron, which sends the response to the signal from the spinal cord to the muscle. Then we have our effector organ. The muscle will then go ahead and contract and withdraw the hand from the cup. That is the effector muscle or gland that performs the action to counteract the stimulus, and that stimulus is that hot cup. So it's important for us to understand these components as it helps grasp how our body responds quickly and efficiently to certain stimuli without any conscious thought. Some key characteristics of a reflex arc I would like to add are they're involuntary, they happen rapidly, and they're automatic. So as we talked about reflexes a little bit on the prior slide, these are rapid automatic responses to a stimulus that occur without conscious thought. These are crucial for maintaining posture, protecting the body from harm, and ensuring coordinated movements. So we have multiple different types of reflexes, and they can be based on different types of things. First, you have based on the effector type, so somatic and autonomic ones. The somatic reflexes control voluntary muscles in response to a stimulus, so they go ahead and go stimulate our skeletal muscles. Then we have the autonomic reflexes. They control involuntary processes like our heart rate and blood pressure and oxygen levels. And effectors of these would be our smooth and cardiac muscles or even our glands. Reflexes can also be based on the integration center. So there's two common integration centers. You have the cranial reflexes, and the integration will occur within the brainstem. Then the spinal reflexes, that integration will be occurring in the spinal cord. Going on to the simple spinal reflexes, you have stretch reflexes. These maintain muscle tone and posture. An example of this would be the knee jerk reflex. Then we have withdrawal reflexes, also known as flexor reflex. It protects the body from injury by withdrawing from a painful stimuli. Then the final one is the cross-extensor reflex. It supports the body by extending the opposite limb when one limb withdraws. Moving on to our final topic, reciprocal innervation. So how does this work? It's a fundamental mechanism that ensures coordinated muscle activity. It involves contraction of one muscle, the agonist, and the relaxation of its opposing muscle, also called the antagonist. So how exactly does it work? When a muscle is stretched, sensory neurons from the muscle spindle send signals to the spinal cord. These sensory neurons then synapse directly with motor neurons that cause the stretched muscle to contract. At the same time, the sensory neurons also synapse with interneurons that inhibit the motor neurons of the antagonist muscle, causing it to relax. So what is the role within the somatic reflexes? Reciprocal innervation goes ahead and plays a role in the stretch reflex. It maintains muscle tone and posture. For example, in the knee jerk reflex, the quadriceps muscle contracts while the hamstring muscle relaxes. Then we have the tendon reflex. It protects muscles and tendons from damage due to excessive tension. When a muscle contracts too forcefully, the tendon reflexes, causing it to relax, and then the antagonist will go ahead and contract. This smooth coordination ensures smooth and efficient movements, preventing muscle injuries and maintaining our balance and posture within our body. And that's the end of my presentation on the peripheral nervous system. I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.